Today, we're tearing down some massive historical assumptions. We're going to look at the Vietnam War, but definitely not just the battlefield tactics or the protest movements you've probably seen in a dozen documentaries. Instead, we're doing a deep dive into the hidden, bureaucratic engines that actually fueled this entire conflict. In this explainer, we're exploring a pretty fascinating study in perception versus reality. We're going to contrast the incredibly idealistic public rhetoric of the time with the stark, often cynical strategic realities happening right behind closed doors in Washington. So we really have to start with one core question. What truly drove America into the Vietnam War? I mean, most of us are taught it was simply this noble battle to save a democratic nation from a communist takeover, right? But what if I told you the underlying motivations were actually drawn up years earlier, on a piece of paper, and were motivated by something way more pragmatic than just protecting freedom? To really understand the hidden policy origins of this conflict, we need to rewind the clock a bit and look at the world stage right after World War II. Because, while the post-World War II world experienced a radical geopolitical shift, before the war you had this multi-state balance of power across the globe, but by the late 1940s, that system had completely collapsed into a fierce, bipolar competition. In one corner, you've got the capitalist United States, in the other, the communist Soviet Union. That brief alliance they shared to defeat Nazi Germany totally disintegrated, and it was replaced by a desperate global struggle for supremacy, power, and prestige. It was basically an ideological staring contest, and whoever blinked first risked losing the entire globe. Which brings us to what is arguably the most important document you might have never even heard of. Let me introduce you to NSC 68. Drafted in 1950 by Paul Nitz and the policy planning staff under Secretary of State Dean Acheson, this was a top-secret national security report that became the absolute, definitive guiding framework for U.S. foreign policy and military expansion for decades to come. And the timing here is absolutely crucial. The Soviets had just successfully detonated their first atomic bomb, and communist forces had just won in China. So Washington was in full-blown panic mode, and NSC 68 became their ultimate playbook for containment. Now, what's truly revealing is the sheer existential dread captured in the text of this report. The authors of NSC 68 didn't just see the Soviet Union as a normal rival. They viewed the Kremlin as an entity entirely designed to retain absolute power and execute global subversion. They literally warned that the U.S. must either be subverted or destroyed by the Kremlin if communism wasn't checked. This incredibly stark, absolute language really drove the American government's belief that the free world just had to be defended at all costs. It set up this ultimate us versus them scenario with absolutely zero room for compromise. So policymakers basically gave President Harry Truman 4 options to deal with this terrifying new threat. Option 1, just continue current policies, but they argued that would leave the military way too weak to act as a deterrent. Option 2, isolation, but they warned that would let the USSR dominate Eurasia and eventually crush America. Option 3 was war, but relying only on atomic weapons wouldn't force a Soviet surrender and worse, would totally destroy Western Europe in the process. So that left option 4, a rapid building up of the political, economic, and military strength of the free world. The administration truly believed this was the only viable path to stop Soviet expansion without literally kicking off World War III. And the immediate consequence of choosing that 4th option was stark. The United States completely abandoned its historic post-war isolationism. Instead, American foreign aid shifted aggressively to prevent the expansion of communism. Under programs like the Mutual Security Act of 1951, the U.S. started pouring billions of dollars into military and economic assistance for non-communist countries. They weren't just rebuilding economies anymore, they were effectively buying loyalty and building a massive global military shield. The stage for aggressive, worldwide intervention was officially set. Okay, so how does this grand global strategy specifically drag the U.S. into the jungles of Vietnam? Well, that brings us to the infamous domino effect. With the fall of Chiang Kai-shek in China back in 1949, CIA intelligence estimates sparked immense fear that a Chinese invasion into neighboring Indochina was imminent. Following the strict, rigid logic of NSC 68, if one nation fell to communism, the surrounding nations would just topple over like dominoes. Because the U.S. had positioned itself as the sole protector of the free world, they felt entirely obligated to step in wherever those dominoes started to wobble. And this doctrine quickly built into an unstoppable escalation. Initially, the U.S. tried to keep its hands somewhat clean by just funding the French colonial war against the communist Viet Minh, eventually paying a staggering 80% of France's war costs by 1954. But when the French withdrew, America stepped in even deeper.
By 1963, President Kennedy had sent 16,000 military advisors to train the South Vietnamese. Then comes the breaking point, the August 1964 Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which officially authorized direct, conventional military force. And by March 1965, the U.S. launches Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive, sustained aerial bombardment campaign.
The numbers themselves are actually pretty staggering. We go from 16,000 military advisors under Kennedy in 1963 to a full-blown combat force of over 184,000 American personnel in Vietnam by the end of 1965. This data-driven irony is hard to miss, right? What started as an ideological policy of containment and advising had rapidly snowballed into a massive ground war. The military buildup recommended by NSC 68 15 years prior had finally materialized in a very real, very physical way in Southeast Asia.
Now, this brings us to the strategic climax of our explainer. We're about to look at one of the most revealing pieces of historical data from the entire Vietnam era. We all know the public perception. The rhetoric on the nightly news was all about protecting the free world, saving democracy, making noble sacrifices. But what were the actual internal priorities of the U.S. government in 1965 as they were deploying hundreds of thousands of young men into active combat? Prepare to have your assumptions challenged. The crucial point is revealed in a 1965 internal memo by U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, John McNaughton. He explicitly broke down American motives for the war. Get ready for this. A whopping 70% of the motivation was simply to avoid a humiliating U.S. defeat, to protect their reputation as a global guarantor. 20% was to prevent South Vietnam from falling under Chinese control. And that noble goal of ensuring the South Vietnamese people maintained a free way of life, that accounted for just 10% of their strategic priority. 70% for reputation, 10% for freedom. It is a stunning historical aha moment. So you have to ask, why was reputation so important that it dwarfed actual freedom by 7-1? Well, we can trace McNaughton's highly pragmatic priority breakdown right back to NSC 68. That original 1950 document explicitly warned that any lapse in American credibility would weaken the resolve of free societies everywhere. If America looked weak in Vietnam, the theory went, allies in Europe would panic and drift toward the Soviets. So this absolute obsession with global credibility effectively forced the United States to stay anchored in a failing war, simply terrified of looking like an unreliable ally. And here is the stark, truly tragic tactical outcome of that obsession with credibility. 58,220. I just want to pause and let that number sink in for a moment. That is the number of American military casualties in the Vietnam War. When policy on a piece of paper meets the reality of the jungle, this is the very real human cost. 58,220 lives, largely spent to avoid the bureaucratic humiliation of a strategic defeat. So, looking back, how do we evaluate the legacy of NSC 68 as a guiding framework? Honestly, it's a tale of two entirely different outcomes. In Western Europe, it was arguably a massive success. The deployment of over 250,000 troops to places like West Germany successfully deterred Soviet invasion, stabilized democracies, and effectively maintained American confidence without sparking a hot war. But when you apply that exact same rigid policy of containment to the highly complex post-colonial landscape of Vietnam, it was a devastating failure. It resulted in a military defeat, an unwinnable quagmire, an immense human tragedy. Which leaves us with one final massive question to ponder. What is the true cost of containment? When a nation commits itself to a rigid, absolute global strategy, one that prioritizes abstract credibility over tangible, on-the-ground realities, the price paid is rarely just financial. The Vietnam War shows us exactly what happens when the fear of appearing weak overrides the logic of strategic withdrawal. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this fascinating and complex history, and I hope this explainer leaves you thinking deeply about the hidden engines that truly drive our world.